Welcome to the Bikini Quilt Block tutorial. It's fun to make and easy too, just 2 fabrics needed. From the background, cut 1 rectangle 2.5 by 8.5, 1 rectangle 2.5 by 4.5, 2 rectangles 1.5 by 2.5, 2 squares 3.5 by 3.5, 2 squares 2.5 by 2.5, and 2 squares 1.5 by 1.5. From a bikini print fabric, cut 1 rectangle 3.5 by 8.5, 2 rectangles 3.5 by 4.5, and 2 rectangles 1.5 by 2.5. Unless directed otherwise, use 1/4-inch seam allowances when piecing the block. I'm going to lay out the block so you know where the pieces will go. All the rectangles that measure 1.5 by 2.5 and the 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch background square will make the swimsuit straps. The 3.5-inch by 4.5-inch bikini print rectangles and smaller background squares make the bikini top. Layer squares right sides together with the print. The 2.5-inch squares go in the upper center corners. The 1.5-inch squares go in the upper outer corners. The 3.5-inch background squares will go on opposite ends of the 3.5 by 8.5-inch bikini print rectangle. Make sure all the pieces are right sides together and pin in place. We used this quilt block for a lottery quilt at our most recent quilt camp in spring of 2024. At the end of the video, you'll see all the blocks that were made during camp. The background 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle will separate the bikini top and the bikini bottom. Now we know where everything goes, it's time to start putting the block together. Sew the smallest rectangles together, the print and the background, and then put the 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangle in between those pieces. Press towards the bikini print fabric. If preferred, you could also press these seams open. For the bikini bottom, sew corner to corner from the outer corners to the inner corners. The seams will mirror each other. You can draw a line to follow, or you can use diagonal seam tape to help guide the seam. Check that you've sewn correctly before trimming excess fabric away. I sewed another seam 1/2 inch away from the first line closer to the corner and cut in between the sewn lines so that I would have spare half-square triangle blocks to use in another block or project. If you decide to make a whole quilt of these blocks, you could work these half-square triangle blocks into the border or into the sashings. I pressed my seams towards the background on this one, but you could also press the seam open or you could press it towards the dark. I like to press my half-square triangle blocks as I go so that I don't end up with a big pile I have to do at some point in the future. For the bikini top, the diagonal lines will go from the top center to lower outer edges as shown. Make sure the 2 sides mirror each other. Double check you've sewn correctly before trimming excess fabric. This part needs to be sewn correctly so that the straps will line up with the bikini top. For the 1.5-inch squares, I just cut away the extra fabric, but for the 2.5-inch squares, I sewed an extra line 1/2 inch away from the first line and then cut in between the 2 sewn lines so I would have a spare half-square triangle to use in another block. I pressed towards the background fabric, but you could also press this towards the dark or press the seams open. Sew the two halves of the bikini top together. Make sure that the larger triangle is the part where you're sewing. Press this seam open. Each of these rows should measure 8.5 inches long. Now it's time to sew them together. Sew the strap row to the bikini top row. I did pin here, matching up the 1/4 inch seam allowances just to make sure everything lined up perfectly. I tried to do it without pinning it, but it didn't turn out exactly the way I wanted to both times that I tried it. So I moved to pinning it because I was making 8 blocks, so I'm glad I learned early. So I highly recommend pinning these, and that way your seam ripper will stay in the drawer. Piece the 2.5 by 8.5 inch background rectangle to the top of the bikini bottom piece. And then sew the two pieces together, making sure that the 2.5 inch by 8.5 inch background rectangle separates the bikini top and the bikini bottom. Press towards the background rectangle and the strap rectangle. The finished size of the quilt block is 8.5 inches by 10.5 inches. I made a bikini from every color of our Party Express Shop Hop bundle. It's super cute in every single color. And I'm also going to show you all the blocks that were made at a quilt camp. The campers managed to find some really fun prints to make their bikinis out of, and I was super happy to see one that was a yellow polka dotted bikini. The large swimsuit is from a pattern called Sanibel, which is a free pattern download on the Moda website. We'll leave a link in the description below for the Sanibel pattern. You can also get a downloadable version of the bikini pattern in the files section of our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends. We hope you will hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!